Good morning, everybody. Yay. Hey, we are so glad to see y'all again. This is our last session in our month of May food crops webinar series. So we are so happy that y'all have hung in there all month long, hanging out with us on Tuesdays to learn more about vegetable gardening. My name is Celeste Scott. I've seen y'all a few times this past month, and today I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers for today and kind of kicking things off. So, first up, we have Mr. Gregg Upchurch. He is the agent in up on the plateau in Cumberland County. That's right, Greg. I got my counties right, didn't I? and today we're really gonna focus on IPM, but we're going to take a couple different approaches. And Greg's approach is going to be looking at it through the lens of cultural controls. And then our second speaker, Seth, who we'll introduce here in a little bit, is going to look at through that lens in more of a I'm sorry, my office phone keeps ringing. I keep having to hang it up. He's going to look at that through the lens of more of scouting, identification, and it's going to be really. I don't know how to make it quit ringing. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to hold the button down. So let's just get things kicked off. Gregg is a wealth of knowledge. He is our go-to soils man and, has been in extension for a long time. And he has a passion for teaching, education. And I'm just going to pass that right off to him. So get us started, Gregg.
Well, first thing I'd like to say is hello to all my friends out there in Zoom land. It is a pleasure to be with you here today. And as Celeste said, Seth and I are going to be talking about insect disease, pest control, weed management today. But my approach today is going to be talking to you primarily just about the cultural and management practices associated with uh, that disease and weed and insect control. And from my standpoint, you hear me talking a lot of times about the different management strategies that we use with controlling diseases and insects. But today, we're going to focus on growing in this section of it and what are those practices that we can do to basically set ourselves up for success and really going to leave all the true pest spraying and things like that and identification to Seth here a little bit later on. So we start talking about managing gardens. It's way more than just spraying for insects. And to the right, you can see a lot of these different cultural things that I'm going to focus on this morning, talking about from a standpoint of site, cultivar selection, crop rotation, water, mulch, vegetation, support systems, plant nutrition, pruning, harvesting, sanitation, and lastly, records. These are all components of a successful gardening season. And notice I don't even really discuss in terms of sprays or spray control or anything like that in those gardens. So whether we're talking about our patio, our backyard, in the field, sunlight's going to be our first and best defense, always. And that's why site selection on those home gardens is so critical. I tell whether it's a fruit orchard or a home vegetable garden, where you put your garden, where you put your orchard is probably the first and foremost, most important thing that you can do. These are full sun plants and they need full sun to be at their very best. And so the other thing I would tell you to put those vegetable plants in your back door. And that's what, we look at this patio container vegetable over here, this tomato growing on our back deck. That vegetable may actually have the best opportunity for success of any vegetable that we've got in our garden. Why? Because it's in the back door. We're going to see that plant when it's got disease problems. We're going to see that plant when the fruit needs to be harvested on it. We're going to see that plant anytime that there's a pest issue that shows up on that. And so that site selection, full sun, good air, where we can see it on a regular daily basis is going to be critical for success within that vegetable garden. Now, beyond what are we going to uh, our next step in terms of having success in terms of that garden, the one thing that I would tell you is resistance plants. Uh, no image identifies this more important than what we see in front of us here, talking about pepper plants that are non-resistant to bacterial leaf spot versus those plants that are resistant to bacterial leaf spot. If you're a vegetable gardener and your interest is growing all organically, clearly the most important thing that you can do is select those cultivars that give us good disease resistance on those plants. Because as you can see, if you're not going to spray, having a plant that's resistant to those different pathogens out there is going to be really important in terms of mitigating how much spray that we need to use in those vegetable gardens. Cultivar selection, we've got a lot of great publications out there. If you go to our UT Hort website, you can see a lot of those that will discuss cultivars that we're going to recommend. But even within those recommended cultivars, you're going to see a lot of those that basically may not have any resistance to any type of disease. And while they may be like the Cherokee Purple Air, may be one of our tried and true favorites that we love to have in our vegetable garden, in terms of disease resistance, there's probably going to be a lot others. When we look at the big beef right above it there, how many uh, different problems that we might have in a garden that plant is actually resistant to right off the bat. Again, reducing those needs that we might have for spraying. Crop rotation. We hear us talk a lot about this, but I think a lot of times homeowners and raised beds maybe tends to get a little bit away from this. Uh, there's a lot of advantages for using good crop rotation from a standpoint of soil health and improvement of that nutrient management. But those things in terms of reducing that disease vector that we've got, where those plants have maybe been in this specific area for a long time and they get a buildup of those pathogens. And the same could be said for insects, pests that may be in that particular area of that bed. So it's really important that we try to rotate those vegetables from site to site to site within our garden. Maybe tends to be a little bit harder in terms of our raised beds, but if you're outside in terms of vegetable gardens, certainly one that you need to adapt into your practice, and probably one of the most important things that we can do for insect and disease pressure is rotating those crops. Dr. Annette Wozlacki's got a great publication that's also at our UT Hort website that talks about crop rotations. And the keys that she mentions in those crop rotations talks about the plant family, the plant part that's harvested, compatibility of those plants. We think about that in the past of the Three Sisters gardens, nutrient requirements, rooting depth, legumes as cover crops, and one that I added in there also to talk a little bit about disease management. And as we see these crops on the screen here, and I would start these vegetables down here in the bottom corner, whether it's our fruit crops or our vine crops, that these are going to be crops that from a pest and disease standpoint are probably going to be some of our higher pest inducing or vegetables that have problems with disease and pests, followed by legumes who are going to be really good nitrogen fixing plants and are going to really add a lot of nutrients back into our soils. And then we look over here to our brassicas and our grains. And our grains, obviously, those sweet corn is kind of that nutrient hog. It's going to be uptaking a lot. So a good crop to follow those beans, followed by our root crops, those that are going to actually expand the soil. They're going to loosen the soil for us. And while I've got potatoes, it is a member of the nightshade family. I still put it in that root crop category, and that's one that is going to be kind of mining that soil in terms of loosening it up for us. Something to really consider in terms of those crop rotations. Watering is another one that I think homeowners, a lot of times, if we're going to see some mistakes made, is one that certainly can show up in those vegetable gardeners. You'll see my bullets over here. I've got two different types of bullets today. I've got rotten tomatoes and I've got healthy tomatoes. And when we see down here in our watering mistakes, overhead watering like that we have in this image and the little pathogen down here thinking that it really feels good, it's kind of what we're doing. We're setting that crop up for potential disease and pest problems within that crop just by watering wrong. You know, in an ideal world, we'd keep the vegetation on these plants dry. We wouldn't create that environment where we could have that pest population string up. I talk a little bit about timing, and a lot of times timing goes hand in hand with watering over the top and keeping that plant wet in a period of time that increases the potential for disease pressures on that crop. And then a lot of times we see with homeowners either overwatering, where they keep them so wet that we get pathogens build up in the soil, or underwatering, we let them completely dry out. So there's a happy medium there. And to water correctly, we're really looking at targeting that soil somewhere to get about an inch to an inch and a half per week. And generally, I recommend that in 2 waterings, that we water deep, get deep into the soil profile, and then allow that soil to have a somewhat of an opportunity to dry out, but not get dry. We need to be really consistent in our watering practices within that garden. One of the main waters that we are often lose track of, that we actually forget about, is humidity and condensation. And if you're growing vegetables inside a greenhouse, this environment over here, we can get a lot of humidity in there. Humidity is moisture. And that moisture in that environment can set that plant up for the potential of having disease and pest pathogens in there. It can create an environment where those pests can actually thrive. So as a rotten tomato tells you there, kind of be careful and think about those things, thinking about airflow. And we can see on the back here, we've got those fans. Those are not for the comfort of the gardener inside the greenhouse, but rather to get the air exchange in that greenhouse out, turn it over to create more of a drying effect on those plants, where we don't set them up for disease just because of the moisture within the air. And this is something we can also see outside in vegetable gardens when humidity gets really high. Mulch. You know, there are a blue million types of different mulches that we can use in a garden. Everything from up here in the top, we see wood chips and leaves, to down here on the bottom, we see a nice straw bed that these tomatoes have been mulched with, to up here in the plastic. Whatever your favorite is, each of these offers true advantages in that vegetable garden. First and foremost, any mulch is going to provide water conservation. They're going to help us keep that moisture a little bit more consistent in that vegetable garden. They can warm the soil, as we see here on these plasticulture tomatoes in the early spring. Man, that black plastic absorbing all that radiant heat will help those tomatoes jump up out of the ground, because that soil is so warm. And at the same time, we can get a cooling effect. Now, some of you may say, well, I think that those tomatoes, that black plastic would be a problem in the summertime. Well, as those tomatoes get really big, they shade the canopy of that plastic, and we really don't have that effect of the heat on that plastic because of the shading of the tomatoes. On the other end, that straw down here can really add in terms of the shading and cooling of that soil. It can also increase the organic matter. But in all these cases, we see a reduction in terms of disease, because we don't see the splashing up on the plants. We see suppression of weed pressures, and we know that there can be a lot of problems associated with those weeds within a garden. So with weed suppression, we can reduce the light competition for that sun. The very first slide I was telling you, sun's critical, and we want the sun. The sun's going to feed the plant, the sun's going to dry the plant. Those weeds can stop airflow through our garden. So we want to reduce any and all that light competition. We want to reduce that nutrient competition that weeds might have, the weeds might have. And by doing that, we're going to reduce insect and disease vectors within that garden. Now, weed removal can be a lot of things. We mentioned the mulch, but man, you can hardly replace, like we see up here, just plain old hand weeding, especially if it's a small raised bed. A hoe, I used to tell gardeners years ago, all my life, #1 weed control measure is a good gooseneck hoe or a hula hoe, that you're just going to cut those things off the ground. but we can also use some tillage here. And with tillage, we're going to be incorporating those weeds. They can break down, release their nutrients back into the soil profile, and we can reduce weed pressures overall. You know, if you've got a raised bed, these two raised beds kind of illustrate which bed's going to have the weed problem next year. The one that we never did anything with, the one that went to seed and has got a tremendous amount of weed and seed vectors in this soil profile, or the bed that we keep nice and neat and clean throughout the season. Notice how healthy these garden vegetables are. Whereas in the top one, it may be a product of let's find the vegetable in this box. One of the things, almost like mulch, that there is a blue million options here is support systems. And that support system can be everything from stock panels that we could get at our farm supply store, our commercial type message where we do a stake and twine. In this case, we're looking at what's commercially we refer to as a Florida weave. Up here, we've got some bale wrapping, netting that works very effective. The point is not necessarily what the material is, and whatever you're comfortable with, whatever you can get cost effective to put up, whatever that you are comfortable working with, that serves as a good option. The key is to understand that support, once again, there's that key word, sunlight, exposes those plants to sunlight. If we are limited in space in a raised garden, these trellises will get the vegetables up to where we can be more compact in our spaces and utilize more space. Disease reduction. Why? Because we get good airflow to it. We get good sunlight to it. And if you're going to use some of the sprays that Seth will talk about in his program, when we've got those up trellised, it just makes it very much easier in terms of getting good coverage of those sprays on our vegetables. And lastly, harvest. Who doesn't prefer picking up rather than stooping down? And so all these support systems can go a long ways in terms of providing benefit to you in your garden space. Essential nutrients, you know, soil fertility and feeding the plants is critical. And I've got up here NP and K. There's no substitute for NP and K. Us as gardeners, we may have philosophical ideas of whether we prefer traditional fertilizers over organic fertilizers, but to the plant, all they know is NP and K and how they need those particular essential nutrients to grow. And a lot of times I think as homeowners, we may be using organic material here in our raised beds, which is great because it loosens that soil, improves the tilth, but we may not necessarily be feeding those vegetables what they need to eat. As in this case, we see these plants very yellowed up and kind of stunted in terms of their growth pattern, and just plants it at a general look that we would say, you know, I think they need to be fed, whether that's an organic fertilizer or whether that's a traditional fertilizer. That's a philosophical discussion, but most importantly, they need NP and K. Within our publications at the UT Hort website, you'll find a tremendous amount of information in there that talks about all these different, whether it's soil testing and potting mix or growing media or soil testing and garden soils, makes no difference. And we'll have a lot of information in there that you can use as a resource to get research-based information on what are those best practices for fertilizing those plants. If you download our UT Garden calendar, you'll see a lot of very useful information in there. And one of those is a table that actually talks about what fertilizer at what timing, what do we need. So we can see crop, timing, when the fruit is 1 inch in diameter, and it gives us those options between a traditional inorganic fertilizer and a organic fertilizer, how much that you're needing, and what is the timing of the fertilization application. Nutrient deficiencies or toxicities are real in gardens, and through poor fertilization management, we can reduce our yields, we can stress those plants, we can weaken the plant's immune system to where they become very susceptible to disease or other pest populations. One of our management practices that, and probably you could say one of the most overlooked, is actual just pruning of vegetables. And there's times that all vegetables need to be pruned. Now, in the case that you're looking here on the image, you've got indeterminate tomatoes growing up these twine trellises, and every one of those tomato plants have been pruned, taking those sucker plants out of that plant. But there's oftentimes that other pruning in other vegetables that could be very important, whether it's just opening up airflow for those tomatoes, but more importantly, removing disease type leaves that are growing on those plants or hosting disease pathogens on those plants, which leads us to another type of pruning, and that's roguing or shovel pruning. Is in the image here, you can see we've got an ADR tomato. And for those of you who are not hillbillies that don't know, ADR stands for ain't doing right. And we've got a tomato plant that ain't doing right. And rather than trying Florence Nightingale this plant back to life and keep that thing alive, let's just go ahead and pull that tomato plant out. You can see the tomato that was planted the exact same day, the same cultivar, growing vigorously here and looks perfectly healthy. And this one here that's ADR, get those plants out of the garden. Don't leave that host plant for disease and pathogens to live in that garden. The other thing that I would tell you, timely harvest of vegetables. Make certain that you get those out of the garden when you need to. We've got another publication, W346I, that talks about the harvesting and the handling of those plants. We don't want to leave those vegetables in those raised beds or in the ground growing beyond their terminal land point to where they serve as a vector for disease and pathogen within those gardens. And at the season's end, clean up. Let's not leave a lot of rotting vegetables and debris in that field to serve as a vector for pathogens for next year. Let's get those plowed under. Let's get our cover crops sown so we can suppress some of those diseases, some of those insects by turning them in, getting a cover crop, or if it's a raised bed, just getting that cover, putting that bed to sleep and not leaving a lot of that rotting residue in that garden space. Again, I mentioned our home fruit and vegetable garden calendar. We've got information in there to where edible PDAs or PDFs where you can actually put your records in from season to season, keep up with your rotation, keep up with the weather, keep up with your pest management, all that information so you can duplicate success and you can eliminate failure. Spraying will not overcome poor management. In this image, you can see tomatoes out here that are disease riddled, they're eat up with vegetation, they're nutrient deprived, they're ADR, they ain't doing right. As opposed to a vegetable garden here that when good management is combined with good IPM management, we can get spectacular vegetable gardens. And just as a sidebar, if you want to know what you're learning here isn't the gospel, this is Dr. Baumgartner's vegetable garden right here. It's a testament that the lady knows exactly what she's talking about when it comes to growing a big, beautiful garden. And since everybody has been showing off their children, I will end up mine for the question section. This is my beautiful daughter and her raised bed outside of her home in Ankeny, Iowa, with her beautiful tomatoes, peppers, and a trellis back here behind, featuring her flowers as well in that vegetable garden. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
All right, Greg, that was great. Thanks so much. I've been kind of keeping my eye on the Q&A, and we've had a few come in, but not just a ton yet. I was going to bounce one of those to you. So I'll make a comment and then I'll ask you to make a comment on this as well. My favorite point of yours that you made today was that spraying cannot overcome poor management. And those two pictures just really prove that point day and night, right? Starting off on a good foot, trying to follow as best you can all these tips and tricks that we've been giving y'all as the sessions have been going through, I think are really going to go a long way to helping you have that vigorous, healthy growing garden that's going to be more resistant to disease and pests, right? Because they have all the things that they need to do well. So, what would be your top tip, your last final word that you would like to leave them with, Gregg?
Well, Celeste, I would say that you're exactly right. Spraying actually is the very last line of defense. The very last. It's the last thing I reach for, not the first. And if you failed on all those things in the beginning, then you put yourself behind the eight ball. For me, the two big take home points I started with sun and sight. Put your garden in your back door where you have to walk through it every day, that you know what's going on in your garden. And hopefully that is full sun, good air with water that you can get to it, that you can manage it correctly. The other thing that I would say, cultivar, 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 because if you are selecting good disease resistant cultivars, you reduce the potential of bringing those pest pathogens in, perpetuating those pathogens within your vegetable garden.
Yes, awesome. Great answer. And so since I said that, that prompted like lots of people to put questions in the question answer box. So I'll throw one of those at you as well. Oh, this is a good one. I used lawn clippings to mulch and I ended up with a weed infestation. So they're trying to do good, right? By trying to get something on the ground. We keep saying cover that ground, use an organic material. But Gregg, tell us what those dangers are when we are mulching with our grass clippings.
So, so if you've got mature grass clippings that's actually going to seed and are weedy, that could be a potential problem. I would tell you that one of my favorite vegetable gardeners in the world, Mr. Fred Mullen, our master gardener here, he grows an unbelievable garden every year using grass clippings. He uses them in raised towers for tomatoes. He uses them over the top of his uh, raised beds in his garden. So you can effectively use grass clippings as a good mulch. However, if you're letting that grass clipping go to a very mature stage, you could have those seeds incorporated. The other thing I would say, those grass clipping or those seeds may be coming in other ways as well. If you're dealing with an annual like crabgrass or goosegrass, those seeds may be blowing in. You may be tracking those seeds in on your wet feet. So there's lots of other ways that those weed seeds could get into a garden beyond just your clippings. I hear people a lot of times say they don't want to use straw because of weed seed. Most of the time with farmers that are actually putting up straw, a lot of that straw doesn't have that much of a weed problem in it. It tends to be a lot cleaner than people give it credit.
Yeah.
So I would tell you those weeds may be coming in other methods other than just your grass clippings.